This is an insult. General Varkoth stood at the edge of the command deck, his cold yellow eyes locked onto the single figure standing in the middle of the battlefield. Around him, his top officers stood in rigid formation, their faces twisted in confusion, disbelief, and simmering anger. The Zalvran Dominion, an empire that had conquered 100 worlds, had issued a challenge to Earth. It was simple: send us your best warriors. Let us test your strength before we take your world. And yet, standing before him was only one. A single human soldier. He wasn't armored. He wasn't carrying a heavy weapon. He wasn't even standing in a battle stance. The human, a male, tall and lean, wore what looked like a simple tactical uniform, its surface dark, textured, but hardly resembling any proper battle armor. His hands were in his pockets. His stance was relaxed, as if he were waiting in line at a food vendor. Varkoth felt his ridged jaw tighten. "Where are the rest?" he growled, his voice carrying over the battlefield's amplifiers. The human tilted his head. "Rest?" Varkoth sneered. "Your army. Your warriors. Surely Earth does not expect a single fighter to stand against the Dominion." The human let out a short chuckle. "No, General. Earth expects me to win." Silence. A ripple of confusion spread through the assembled Zalvran forces. Varkotha's clawed hand clenched into a fist. "This is cowardice." His voice was sharp, almost snarling. "Your leaders have failed you, human. They have sent you to die alone." The human shook his head, almost amused. "No, they sent me because one is enough." Murmurs broke out among the Zalvran soldiers. Their hulking, armored frames twitched with uncertainty, their instincts screaming that something was off. But the general ignored them. He would not let his soldiers be swayed by this ridiculous display. "Enough of this nonsense," Varkoth snarled. He turned to his second-in-command, Commander Zeltor. "Dispatch the first blade. Kill him." Zeltor hesitated. "General, perhaps we should." "Now." The command was obeyed. From the Zalvran ranks, 5 warriors stepped forward. They were the first blade, the Dominion's finest duelists. Each of them had conquered planets alone, their bodies genetically enhanced, their weapons forged from superheated plasma. Varkoth watched as they moved in perfect formation, fanning out to flank the human. The human didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't react. Varkoth allowed himself a smirk. A fool's bravado. He would regret it. "Engage," he ordered. The first blade launched forward. Their movements were impossibly fast, enhanced by combat stimulants and decades of experience. Plasma blades ignited, slashing through the air, aimed to sever limb from body in a single stroke. Then, something happened. The human stepped forward once, and the first blade collapsed. All 5 of them. Instantly. They didn't fall like defeated warriors. They dropped, their bodies twitching, limbs convulsing as if their nervous systems had been hijacked. Their weapons clattered to the ground. The battlefield was silent. Varkotha's smirk vanished. What did you do?" he demanded. The human rolled his shoulders. "Non-lethal compliance." Varkotha's claws dug into the railing. He turned to his commander. "Get them back on their feet." Zeltor rushed forward, scanning the fallen warriors. Their bodies were uninjured. Their vitals were stable. And yet they couldn't move. Panic flickered in the commander's eyes. "General, they are conscious. But their bodies will not respond." A wave of unease swept through the Dominion forces. Their best warriors had fallen, without a single attack. Varkoth turned back to the human. "What is this trickery?" The human smiled. "I told you. One is enough." Varkoth felt something he hadn't experienced in centuries. A cold whisper of doubt. His gaze flicked to the hundreds of warriors standing behind him. The ones who had just watched their elites fall without a fight. They were nervous. Zalvran warriors never hesitated. And yet they hesitated now. Varkoth scowled. "Enough of this. Deploy the next wave. 100 warriors." The order was given. 100 warriors stepped forward. Plasma rifles armed. Shields raised. Varkotha's hands tightened. This time the human would fall. And yet, the human just smiled. "Finally," he murmured. "I was getting bored." Then he took his hands out of his pockets. The moment he moved, the battlefield changed forever. The Dominion expected a slaughter. They were right. But they had never imagined it would be their own. The human moved. And the war was lost. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't even a proper stance. It was a simple step forward. Yet, to the warriors of the Zalvran Dominion, it felt like death approaching. 100 Zalvran soldiers stood ready, weapons primed, shields active, formation perfect. These were not just warriors, they were the crushing force of a galactic empire, trained from birth to overwhelm, destroy, dominate. And yet, they hesitated. It was a moment, a fraction of a second. But in war, a fraction of a second decides everything. The human grinned. There it is. Then he moved. The first kill. It wasn't a charge. It wasn't a mad sprint. It was effortless. A flicker of motion, one breath, one step. And the first Zalvran soldier crumpled. The warrior didn't scream. He didn't even realize what had happened. 1 second he was standing. The next, his body folded like paper. His rifle vanished from his grip. His shield shattered before it even deployed. His massive form, clad in Imperial battle armor, was sent flying backward like a ragdoll. Silence. Then, chaos. Blaster fire erupted from the ranks. The air burned with plasma rounds, lighting the battlefield in a deadly glow. The human should have been incinerated instantly. He wasn't. He was gone. The plasma rounds tore through empty air, hitting nothing, hitting no one. And then he was inside their ranks. The slaughter begins. Zalvran battle formations were perfected over centuries. They were built for raw power, overwhelming numbers, crushing strategy. But their one flaw. They had never fought an enemy like this. The human was fluid motion, a shadow that weaved through the armored soldiers as if they weren't even there. One warrior turned to fire, a mistake. The human's hand lashed out. Not a weapon. Not a gun. Just his hand. He struck the Zalvran's chest, and the armor caved inward. The soldier hit the ground, gasping for breath, his ribs shattered. The human didn't slow down. Another warrior lunged at him, plasma blade igniting. The human sidestepped. One motion. One strike. And the warrior collapsed, unconscious, his body shutting down before it even registered pain. In less than 10 seconds, 5 soldiers were down. And the human? He was smiling. The general's realization. Up on the command deck, General Varkatha's claws dug into the railing. This is. His voice trailed off. Impossible. This wasn't a battle. This was a demonstration. The human wasn't fighting for survival. He wasn't even breaking a sweat. And his body language, not panicked, not tense, not desperate, relaxed, amused, like a predator playing with its food. Varkatha's second-in-command, Zeltor, watched in stunned horror. Sir, our men aren't landing a single hit. Varkatha's jaw clenched. Double the force. Deploy the elites. His voice shook. For the first time in his military career, he was unsure. Because deep down he knew. It wouldn't make a difference. And that realization terrified him. The Dominion expected resistance. Instead they found a nightmare. He's just one man. Kill him. General Varkatha's voice thundered across the battlefield, but there was no confidence behind it. Only desperation. He had sent 100 warriors, the best of his Dominion forces, to erase a single human soldier. They were failing. Now he was sending more. The order was given. 500 warriors advanced. Their plasma rifles locked, their energy blades humming, their shields engaged. This time the human would fall. He had to. But as the troops charged, a terrible realization spread through their ranks. The human wasn't running. He wasn't retreating. He was walking toward them. A battlefield in silence. War is supposed to be loud. Explosions, battle cries, the roar of weapons. But this battlefield was silent. Not because of strategy, but because fear had settled in the hearts of the Dominion's warriors. They watched what had happened before. They saw how the first wave fell without resistance. And now, as they stood against a single man, something inside them screamed at them to turn back. But they couldn't. Their honor, their orders, their pride, everything chained them to this fight. And so they charged. The human exhaled. Fine. Let's get this over with. He moved. Speed beyond understanding. One step. He vanished. Not through teleportation, not with a cloaking device, but through sheer, impossible speed. The first Dominion soldier barely had time to blink before the human appeared in front of him. A fish struck his chest plate. The impact was instantaneous. Armor crumpled. Bone shattered. The soldier's feet left the ground, his body launched backward like a missile. By the time he hit the ground, the human was already inside their ranks. The collapse of a legion. Blasters fired in all directions, soldiers desperately trying to track their target. They failed. The human was everywhere and nowhere. A soldier tried to raise his rifle. A hand closed around his wrist. One twist. A snap. The warrior collapsed, his arm dangling uselessly. Another soldier swung a plasma sword. The human ducked, grabbed the alien's throat, and slammed him into the ground with enough force to crack the stone beneath. A group of 10 warriors tried to coordinate. The human saw it coming. He grabbed a discarded rifle. One shot. Not at them but at the ground. The shockwave sent dust and debris into the air, blinding them. In that single moment of hesitation, he was among them. Throat strikes. Joint locks. Precision takedowns. None of them could react fast enough. Within seconds, all 10 were down. The first retreat in Dominion history. Above the battlefield, General Varkoth watched in horror. The Dominion did not retreat. It was a concept that did not exist in their military doctrine. And yet, his warriors were breaking. Some had already begun backing away. Others lowered their weapons. One dropped his rifle and ran. Varkotha's claws dug into the metal railing. "And oh," he roared. "Hold your ground. You are warriors of the Dominion. You do not flee." But they did. Because they had never seen anything like this. They had faced wars, sieges, planetary invasions. But never a predator. Never something that hunted them. The human speaks. The human finally stopped moving. He stood among hundreds of fallen warriors. His uniform was untouched. His breathing was calm. His expression? Bored. He looked up at the command deck, straight at Varkoth. And then he raised his hand. Not in a threat. In a beckoning motion. "Send more." Silence. Then, a single Dominion officer, still conscious, dropped his weapon. Varkotha's blood ran cold. The moment he had feared most was now reality. His men had given up. The human had broken their will to fight. For the first time in Dominion history. A battle had been lost before it had even begun. The Dominion came to test Earth's warriors. Instead, they discovered Earth didn't need an army. One soldier was enough. The Dominion did not understand fear until now. General Varkoth stood frozen, his breath shallow, his claws gripping the command deck railing so tightly that the metal groaned under the pressure. Below, his army was collapsing. The Dominion's finest warriors, soldiers who had never known defeat, were dropping their weapons, stepping back in fear, some even running. And at the center of it all, one human. Untouched. Unbothered. Unstoppable. The general's delusion. Varkoth refused to believe what he was seeing. This was supposed to be a demonstration of Dominion power. They were supposed to break humanity's will before launching their full-scale invasion. Instead, it was his own forces that were breaking. No, this wasn't happening. "This is not possible," Varkoth growled, forcing himself to breathe. He turned to Zeltor, his second in command. "Order the High Guard to move in. Crush him." Zeltor hesitated. His scales rippled with unease. "Sir." His voice was quiet. Too quiet. "The men. They don't want to go down there." Varkotha's head snapped toward him. "What did you just say?" Zeltor swallowed hard. "They are afraid, General." That single sentence hit harder than any enemy strike. The High Guard were the Dominion's elite, a force that had conquered entire worlds without hesitation. And now they hesitated. Varkoth refused to accept it. "Execute any soldier who refuses to fight," he snarled. Zeltor flinched. "But sir, if we kill them for retreating, who will be left to fight?" Silence. Varkoth had no answer. For the first time in his long career, he was out of options. The human's last offer. Down on the battlefield, the human stood alone, hands still in his pockets. Dominion warriors lay scattered around him, groaning, unconscious, or too broken to continue. He exhaled, shaking his head. "I thought you people were warriors." The words cut deeper than any blade. A few of the remaining soldiers lowered their heads in shame. Others simply looked away. The human tilted his head, then looked directly at the command deck, as if he could see through the layers of reinforced glass. And then he spoke. "General." The single word sent a chill through Varkotha's bones. "Call them off. Walk away. Before you embarrass yourself any further." Murmurs rippled through the Dominion officers. "Arrogant filth," Varkoth spat. He slammed a fist against the railing. "You will die here, human." The human sighed. "You know, I wasn't sent here to kill anyone," he said, his voice calm. "Earth thought this would be a simple demonstration. A way to avoid unnecessary war." He gestured at the fallen soldiers around him. "But if you keep pushing, I'll have to prove why sending just me wasn't an insult." A slow realization crept into Varkotha's mind. The human wasn't fighting seriously. He had disabled soldiers, not killed them. He had dodged attacks effortlessly, never once being pushed to his limit. How much stronger was he, really? A deep dread settled in Varkotha's gut. What if this was just a warning shot? The breaking point? Zeltor stepped forward hesitantly. General? His voice wavered. Perhaps we should. Silence. Varkoth roared. But his fury couldn't hide the shaking in his voice. He had one last chance to hold on to his power. One last command that might turn the tide. All remaining forces, attack. No one moved. The command hung in the air like a death sentence. 1 second. 2. Then, a Dominion soldier dropped his rifle. The sound of metal hitting the ground was deafening. Another soldier removed his helmet. Then another. One by one, warriors of the mighty Dominion, some of the greatest soldiers in the galaxy, surrendered. Varkoth felt his chest tighten. He had lost. Not to a war. Not to a superior army. But to one man. The human exhaled, shaking his head. You could have just left, General. Varkoth staggered back. His entire body felt numb. The Dominion had never surrendered before. They had never backed down. And yet they had now. Because for the first time in history, they had met something stronger than themselves. Varkoth stared at the human, his vision blurred with rage and disbelief. Oh, how did one man do this? And worse, what would happen if Earth ever decided to send more? The Dominion had never needed mercy, until today. General Varkoth had never bowed, never pleaded, never once looked upon an enemy with anything but contempt. Yet here he stood, his forces shattered, his pride in ruins, staring down at one man, the only soldier Earth had sent. And now he needed answers. The walk of defeat. The battlefield was silent. Hundreds of Dominion warriors knelt in surrender, their weapons discarded, their gazes averted. The weight of humiliation hung over them all. The human stood in the center of it all, arms crossed, expression unreadable. He wasn't tired. He wasn't wounded. He wasn't even concerned. Varkoth FRCD himself to move. His armor felt heavier with every step as he walked toward the human, the being who had destroyed everything he believed in. Stopping just a few paces away, he exhaled, forcing his voice to remain steady. What are you? The human tilted his head, brow raised. You already know the answer to that, General. Varkoth's claws twitched. He wanted to roar in frustration, to strike, to do anything but stand here, powerless. Instead he took a slow breath. One soldier, he said, voice hoarse. One. Your leaders sent you alone, and we still could not stop you. The words tasted like poison. The human nodded. That's right. Varkoth's fists clenched. Why? Why only one? A smirk flickered across the human's lips. Because one was enough. The truth that shattered an empire. Varkoth shook his head, refusing to accept it. We have conquered empires, broken worlds, faced the greatest warriors the galaxy has ever known. And yet, you tore through us as if we were nothing. You could have killed us all, but you didn't. He took a step forward, his eyes burning with a question he didn't want to ask. Why? The human finally unfolded his arms, his demeanor shifting, not mocking, not arrogant, just calm and certain. Because we don't fight wars the way you do. Varkoth's breath hitched. The human continued, voice steady. You fight for dominance. For control. You think power is about standing on top of others. But humanity? We don't fight for ego. We fight to win. He gestured toward the defeated Dominion army. And if we ever wanted this war, General, we wouldn't have sent just one. The meaning hit like a meteor. Varkoth's vision blurred. This wasn't humanity at full strength. This was them holding back. The final realization. Varkoth staggered back. The full weight of the truth crushed him. Earth had not sent an army because they didn't need to. Humanity wasn't just strong. They were beyond anything the Dominion had ever faced. Zeltor stepped beside him, his voice low. Sir, what do we do? For the first time in his life, Varkoth had no answer. He turned to the human. His pride was gone. Then tell me, he said. What happens next? The human studied him for a moment, then gave a small, almost pitying smile. That depends on you. Varkoth's heart pounded. For the first time, the Dominion was no longer in control. And it terrified him. Varkoth had spent his life breaking civilizations. Now he understood what it felt like to be on the other side. The Dominion had ruled for centuries. Now they would be remembered for their surrender. General Varkoth stood in the wreckage of his pride, surrounded by the kneeling soldiers of his once mighty army. The battlefield, which should have been a monument to Dominion strength, was instead a graveyard of shattered egos. And standing at the center of it all, one human. Untouched. Unbothered. Undisputed. The war was over before it had even begun. A choice that wasn't a choice. Varkoth forced himself to speak. His voice, once full of authority, was now hollow. What happens next? The human considered him for a moment. Then he simply shrugged. That depends on you. Varkatha's claws curled into fists. You could have killed us all, he said bitterly. Yet you didn't. Why? The human sighed. Because Earth doesn't fight wars it doesn't need to. Varkath swallowed hard. And if we continue? The human's gaze darkened, his smirk vanishing. Then next time, he said simply, we won't send just one. A chill settled over the Dominion officers. No threats. No displays of power. Just a fact. And for the first time in Dominion history they backed down. The fall of an empire. Varkath turned to his second-in-command, Zeltor. His voice was quiet. Order the retreat. Zeltor hesitated. Sir? Varkatha's jaw tightened. Do it. The command echoed through the ranks. One by one, Dominion warriors stood down. The invasion fleet, once poised to conquer Earth, turned back. The Dominion had never surrendered before. Now it was the only thing they could do. The legend spreads. By the time the Dominion fleet returned to their homeworld, the news had already spread. Across the galaxy, whispers of the battle that wasn't a battle spread like wildfire. Civilizations that once feared the Dominion now watched with amusement. And those who once doubted humanity now feared them. Because Earth had sent only one soldier. And one soldier was enough. The Dominion had ruled the stars. Now they prayed they would never see Earth's full strength.